The Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust is one of the more distinctive housing providers of the first part of the 20th century in Ireland. And the Killester housing scheme, the Killester Garden Village, is certainly the most distinctive housing area. Most of this lecture is going to be concerned with the operation of the Land Trust in the years after 1926. But before we get to that, it's useful to have a look at the genesis of the trust and of the creation of the Killester scheme. The Killester scheme grows out of a promise which was made to ex-servicemen coming back from the trenches of World War I, that they would come back to a world in which they were treated better than they had been, and in particular one in which they would find that they were given far better housing. This was a promise which had gradually evolved during the course of the war, and Major Henry Lefroy in Ireland had been a very strong supporter of the concept. Truth to tell, the idea had been around for some time. There was concern in the UK about declining productivity in rural areas, and one suggestion was that it would be a good idea to settle ex-servicemen on the land, and that by so doing that farms would find their productivity increased, and that the overall strength of rural communities would be improved. It would also have the welcome effect of having some impact on the very, very high population densities in the larger cities. But the idea became a reality in the general election campaign of 1918, when Lloyd George, in one of his election speeches, talked about the UK becoming a land fit for heroes to live in. And this soon got translated and soon got shortened into the idea of homes fit for heroes. This idea, this promise, probably didn't resonate an awful lot in Ireland at the time, because there was a lot more going on, and interest in the election campaign in the UK was probably not foremost in the minds of people. But they probably had noticed a proclamation which had been issued by the Lord Lieutenant, Lord French, earlier in the year. There had been quite a hostile reaction in Ireland to the notion of introducing conscription, and the idea had been quietly dropped by the British government. But at the same time, Lord French was of the view that he needed to send about 50,000 volunteers to the trenches, and to do that he issued a proclamation which contained the paragraph which is repeated here. It says, "We recognise that men who come forward and fight for their motherland are entitled to share in all that their motherland can offer. Steps are therefore being taken to ensure as far as possible that land shall be available for men who have fought for their country, and the necessary legislative measure is now under consideration." It took a little while, but that promise was given effect by the Irish Land Provision for Sailors and Soldiers Act of 1919. There'd be two distinct elements to it. The first, for a smaller group of people, these would be people who would become full-time farmers, and they would be given land to farm, which would be provided by the Land Commission. The second and larger group would not necessarily be even part-time farmers, but these would be ex-servicemen who would be provided with a plot of ground on which they could grow food and a good house. This would be provided by the Local Government Board for Ireland. And building got underway pretty much immediately, and within a very short space of time there were projects underway in most parts of Ireland. The idea was to create what were called colonies. At least that's what the Chief Secretary for Ireland, Macpherson, referred to in his speech in the British Parliament. The idea being that you would gather these ex-servicemen together into small communities, which would give them a degree of social cohesion and also a degree of support. Most people believed that this was going to be a long-term project, that it was going to be quite some time before the demands of all ex-servicemen would be met. But His Majesty's Treasury didn't see it that way. They saw this as a short-term thing, and probably an election promise which could be dealt with and then forgotten about. The local government board's powers were limited to 3 years, and it was very clear from this that not everybody was going to get a house. Nonetheless, schemes were started in Dublin, And here we find the Sandymount Seaford Garden scheme coming to completion in 1923. It's a very interesting scheme. It's a scheme of 42 dwellings which are built on the old grounds of the Shelbourne Football Club. It's under the aegis of the Board of Works with G&T Crampton as contractors. There are 2-bedroom houses, mostly semi-detached. There's only 4 detached houses in it, but if you look at the plot, you can see that the houses have got quite a large plot area and they've got good gardens. They're also quite distinctive. I mean, you would recognise those anywhere with their distinctive roofs. The Board of Works must have liked the design because they used exactly the same design down in Galway in the Claddagh. Another development the same period is in Kingstown in Dunleary, and this is on Library Road and is Rosary Gardens. Here the houses are a mixture of semi-detached and terraced houses. They're also 2-bedroomed, but there's a parlour and there's a living room. There's a scullery, a cold store, WC, and the bathroom has hot and cold running water. Very much, up to the minute in terms of what you would expect. These two have a distinctive design. There are red tiles on the roof. There are coloured blocks on the front walls. But both of those schemes were much, much smaller than what was going to be planned for Killester. And Killester is probably bigger than the local government board would have contemplated, were it not for the fact that through a series of events, this very large site fell into their lap. Now, the acquisition of the site is a story in itself, but it's a story for another day. This was going to become the largest scheme by far. The site is a big one. You can get a sense of it here if I just go around it in rough terms. It's on either side of the railway to Howth, and it had originally been part of the Howth estate. So the local government board wonders who it's going to get to build this, because here's the opportunity to do something significant. So they turn to Frank Mears, the Scottish architect and planner. Now, Mears had got to know Dublin quite well. He had come over with Geddes, and he had worked with Geddes and with Unwin in developing advice for Dublin Corporation about their new schemes for social housing. And he was clearly liked by the local government board for Ireland. And it was to him that they looked when they were looking for a designer. Now, Mears was always going to build a garden suburb because he was imbued with the idea of garden cities and with the idea of garden suburbs. And so what he has is he's got a perfect site. He's got a site which has a lot of open ground, but it's got a lot of trees as well. And he decides that he's going to do something unusual, that he's going to use bungalows rather than the standard 2-storey houses which the local government board for Ireland had been using, and he's going to spread them across the area, and he's going to retain a lot of the trees, and it's going to be pretty well a low density development. Now, it's not going to be an egalitarian development. Class distinctions are going to be maintained by differentiating the houses. So there will be big houses and there'll be smaller houses and there'll be smaller houses again, and these will be available at different rents. It was also going to be part of a larger garden suburb because as Mears, as I said, had become well integrated into Dublin society, and there was quite an interest in town planning and particularly garden city planning in Dublin at the time, and he would have come into contact with E.A. Aston. Now, E.A. Aston is one of the significant figures of the time. He's involved in a wide variety of social projects. He's pretty well on every committee that you can think of, and he's also a businessman. And he sees the opportunity to develop a private garden suburb as part of this larger development. He and Mears clearly collaborated with each other. Mears helped Aston with the overall design of Aston's garden suburbs, and it would have been very interesting had Aston managed to pull it off, but he didn't. His particular part of the project wasn't really a success, so what gets built is the Mears part of it. Now, here's the final design. The plan is for 247 houses, much, much bigger than anything the local government board had attempted so far. It's going to be divided into 3 distinct areas because the domain had been structured into 3 fields, and Mears decided he was going to keep that. He was going to call them Abbeyfield, Middle Third, and the domain. And you can see them here: Abbeyfield, Middle Third, the domain down here. And the domain would be separated physically by the railway, but also socioeconomically, because it's in the domain that the larger houses would be built. 32 detached bungalows would be provided within the scheme. The remainder would be semi-detached, and these houses would be built in different configurations of 2 and 3 bedrooms. Some houses would be smaller, so there would be 3 different categories of house sizes, and, as I say, different configurations within that. And the idea is that this would reflect the social differentiation of the army. So the officers would be mainly in the largest houses, the privates would be mainly in the smallest houses. Now, not a rigid distinction, it did depend on the ability to pay rent, but you can see that this is not going to be an egalitarian society. This is going to reflect the usual divisions in society for the time, and indeed as you would get now. The scheme as built was very close to the original design. This is how it looked in 1936. You can see that the houses occupy large plots, there are good gardens, there's quite a lot of open space, and Mears has retained quite a number of the existing trees within the domain. The main difference is that there has been an infill development here, which is quite different in how it appears. This is a development of terraced housing. And there's been some infill development here. The open space which Mears had originally intended to provide in the middle of Abbeyfield has been built upon, and they fitted a number of houses in there, and they've extended the gardens, and the same is true down here in the domain. But otherwise, it's pretty well as Mears would have intended. We now come to the Free State. The Free State changed everything. There was some suggestion, in fact, that as the Free State came into existence, that this would end the provision of housing, because was the British government going to continue to pay for housing developments in the Free State, and was the Free State going to pick up the tab? As it turned out, and perhaps as a result of all of the lobbying, the Irish Free State Consequential Provisions Act of 1922 set out a mechanism which would allow the process to continue. They were going to set up a trust. They were going to set up the Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust, and the trust would be administered by 5 trustees, 3 of whom would be appointed by the British government, 1 by the President of the Executive Council of the Irish Free State, the government, and 1 by the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. Now this makes it quite interesting. This is an imperial trust, an imperial organisation which is headquartered in London, operating out of London with UK funds, operating in the Free State, building houses in the Free State. Now, it's not clear what kind of relationship there's going to be between it and the Executive Council. In fact, we'll come to that a little bit later on. But it's going to be an interesting relationship. Now, the Treasury, true to form, were not inclined to be generous in its funding for this operation. There was a great deal of wrangling about how much money the trust was going to be given, and eventually a figure of 1.3 million was settled upon as a full and final settlement of the promise. Even more precise, and perhaps even more bizarre, a limit of 2,626 dwellings was set in the Free State. Now that precision is very, very strange. It's not based on any assessment of need. It's somebody sitting down and working out the average cost of this kind of house in this kind of area, and then dividing it into 1.3 million and deciding how many houses you could get for 1.3 million and saying, if you can get them cheaper, we'll take the change, thank you very much. So 2,626 is the full extent of the promise. The Land Trust took a while to get going. There was some difficulty about finding trustees, but it gets going in 1925. By then, 1,508 houses have been completed, and there's a further 112 under construction. So the trust is more than halfway towards its target. So with perhaps 1.3 million, it's going to find it relatively straightforward to do, perhaps. The trust inherited Killester. Killester was largely complete by the time the trust took it over. There was the addition of orchard and the infill development that I spoke about a few minutes ago. There's a very strong community spirit in Killester. It is a cohesive community. There's enthusiastic participation in Remembrance Days, which is reported in the newspapers. There are social and sporting events which command significant support amongst the residents. They are a community, they see themselves as a community, and they're big enough that organisations like the gas company feel that they can use them in advertising. Here you have an advertisement for gas, and they're saying basically, if the people in Killester can use gas, why don't you? Contributing to that cohesion is the fact that even by 1933, the development is still quite rural, it's still quite suburban. If we look at the Ordnance Survey map for that year, you can see that it's here, and that the area around it is still largely greenfield. It's either agricultural or it's domain. There's very little housing nearby. Now granted, if you look along the Howth Road, you can see that housing has crept out from the city, and if you travelled along the Howth Road, you would get a false impression of continuous development. Dublin Corporation's developments are coming closer. We have the completed Merino scheme here, and we have the beginnings of what is going to be the much larger Donecarney scheme here. But still, in the 1930s, this is still a community on its own. Now, granted, it has reasonable connectivity to the city centre in that there is the railway line from Howth, runs right through the community, and a railway station has been provided. There had been one there before, but it had closed in the middle part of the 19th century. So the railway station is open again, so you can get into town, well, on a reasonably frequent basis. But they also had something more interesting. They also had their own bus company. Now, the 1920s in Dublin is a period of unregulated bus companies, and there are any number of them. There are large numbers of different bus companies, many of which operate on single routes, and it's the Wild West. There are very few rules. There are bus stops, certainly, but as often as not, a bus will stop anywhere on the road suddenly if it gets any hint that there might be a passenger wishing to travel. Buses are notorious for racing each other to bus stops in order to pick up passengers. Crashes are commonplace, and the Dublin Opinion cartoon, what I like about it is that it's Killester. It captures the essence of Killester, which is served by two bus companies. There is the big bus company, in fact it's the predatory bus company, the Dublin United Tramways Company. This is the company that runs the trams and is now going to run the buses, and which ultimately is going to become the only and dominant bus company. And then there is the local bus company, the Contemptible Bus Company. Now it's an interesting name. It's not an insult. It's a reference to the old contemptibles of the 19th century. But I think it's good that here we get the notion of the competition between these two bus companies. The postcard on the right hand side is from the same period, and it shows the developing shopping area in Killester, but it shows you one of the buses from the DUTC, where the photographer has persuaded the driver to park the bus across the main road so it can be fitted into the picture. It'll be clear in a few minutes that there were issues with how the ex-servicemen felt that they were being treated by the agencies of the state and by society generally. But that wasn't manifested in any kind of difficulties with Dublin Corporation. And so you find the trust being given land as part of Dublin Corporation's development. Here on the left-hand side, you can see the area which is given to the trust as part of the reserved area scheme in the Drumcondra area. Reserved areas was an initiative of Dublin Corporation whereby they finished off their own social housing schemes by providing more expensive houses, sometimes all the way around, and sometimes in the case of Drumcondra to the north of their own scheme. The idea was that they would improve the appearance of the area, but they would also improve the socio-economic profile of the area. On the right hand side, we can see the same kind of provision in Cabra. Here on the left hand side around Quarry Road, you find 3 cul-de-sacs of houses being provided by the land trust, very adjacent to Dublin Corporation's own housing development. In the case of Drumcondra, the scheme is 66 houses. In the case of Cabra, it's 76 houses. Still nothing as big as Killester. And there's quite a number of these in Dublin. Here's another 2. There's one in Castleknock. Park Villas is the scheme of 28 houses. It's quite rural, as the map shows, houses on large plots, and the city is not long in catching up with them, and the plots are so big that the houses are extended and developed to the point that you wouldn't recognise them today. And in Ballantyre, a scheme of 58 houses completed in and around 1932, where again the trust uses the cul-de-sac design, but where we also see the notion of differentiation of house type, because here at the edge we get 3 detached bungalows, more expensive, and reflecting again the fact that the trust saw itself as dealing with different socio-economic groups. The trust wasn't shy about proclaiming the distinctiveness of their areas. Where they could, and particularly on the left-hand side, this is what they would use as the entrance to a cul-de-sac scheme. You see a very, very distinctive stone wall leading you into the entrance to the scheme, with these very distinctive pillars, which some people say were designed on the basis of shell casings. Where they couldn't do that, where perhaps the houses were more terraced, you would find a plaque. A plaque like this would appear prominently, perhaps in the middle of a terrace, perhaps at the end of a terrace, and would say very clearly that the Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust built these houses. So there was no shyness about what they were doing. There was no sense that they wanted to hide these away. But there were problems. From the beginning, the Land Trust found that it had difficulties. Rents in Killester were high. The most expensive houses in Killester were charging rents which were at the same level as the tenant purchase houses in Marino. The big difference, though, is that if you were in a tenant purchase house in Marino, you would own the house, whereas in Killester you would be paying rent in perpetuity. His Majesty's Treasury had made no effort to link rents to income. They had simply looked at the cost of the development, had come to a view as to how much income it needed to generate, and simply divided that by the number of houses. They took no account of the fact that many of the tenants in Killester were unemployed, and that many of them were disabled. And as a result, rents were not paid, arrears began to accumulate. And very, very quickly the trust found itself with an arrears problem. Here you find the Northern Ireland trustee speaking to the annual general meeting of the Ulster Ex-Servicemen's Association in Belfast in January 1925. And he says in many cases tenants made no serious attempt to pay their rents and virtually set at defiance all authority. There were bad cases where tenants had paid no rent for 2 years. And then he goes on to say, of course, we've got ways of dealing with this. And, it suggested that a hard line was going to be taken. Now, in fact, a hard line wasn't taken. And anyway, the Trust developed a policy that rents should only meet maintenance costs and administration costs. There was no need for a capital sum to be put aside because they were going to build all the houses that they needed to build. They had a target initially of just shy of 2,700, and they'd been able to increase that a little bit through economies that they had achieved, but they were well on their way to meeting the target. So they didn't see themselves as needing to put away money for future development. They just saw themselves as needing to have enough money to keep the thing going. They found themselves with a rent strike going on. There was a rent strike in Killester in 1924. Now, the trustees were very sympathetic to the tenants. The trustees were all military men, and they knew what the First World War had been like, and they knew the conditions that people had endured, and they knew the service that they had given. And they were very reluctant to evict anybody. But at the same time, they also understood discipline, and they were very upset at the rent strike because they saw this as ill discipline, that this was not what ex-soldiers did. Nonetheless, reluctantly, they noted that if it was their scheme and if they were now building it, they would now be charging rents which were much lower. And so they agreed to a very significant reduction in the rents. So the original rents of 10 shillings, 12 shillings and sixpence and 16 shillings per week went down by 4 shillings per week each. Now that's a very significant reduction. And the Trust assumed that that would be it, that would solve the problem. The tenants, however, were not convinced, and the protest continued, with the tenants paying a protest rent plus an additional 2 shillings a week to deal with arrears. The rent strike was symptomatic of a wider unhappiness amongst the community of ex-servicemen. It wasn't just Killester. Killester was big enough and coherent enough that it was able to make a statement of its own. But there was a general feeling amongst ex-servicemen that they were not being treated well in this new Free State. It was felt that there was discrimination in public service jobs. So you find the Dublin branch of the Association of Ex-Service Civil Servants commenting in January 1925 that the treatment meted out to ex-servicemen was the very thing to make men turn Bolsheviks at a time when the country was trying to keep down Bolshevism. There was a feeling that there was discrimination in business generally, that ex-servicemen were not being promoted, that ex-servicemen were not getting the jobs that they were qualified for. And there was a feeling that the state itself was not recognising the service which had been given by ex-servicemen, and in particular there had been a failure to construct a suitable national war memorial. Which was the level of agitation that the Executive Council decided that it needed to have a public inquiry, that it really needed to get this out into the open and to deal with it. And they established that public inquiry in November 1927. They got Cecil Lavery, KC, to act as chair of the inquiry, and Lavery was a distinguished lawyer and a very respectable lawyer. The inquiry met during 1928 and it held 18 meetings. There are very significant minutes of these meetings, and they show a considerable engagement between the committee and the various parties involved. You find the British Legion, which is now effectively the representative body of ex-servicemen, making a very strong case on their behalf, and you find Henry Lefroy also significantly involved in advocacy for the ex-servicemen. But the report came to the view that there was no systematic discrimination of ex-servicemen. Now, by that they meant that they recognised that the ex-servicemen had problems. Unemployment was a problem, poverty was a problem, But they said they were no different to other people in similar socio-economic circumstances. In other words, they didn't have these problems because they were ex-servicemen. They had these problems because they were the poor. They were in the lower socio-economic groups. And that pretty well absolved the government from doing anything in particular for ex-servicemen. Now, naturally, they could do things for society as a whole, but there wasn't a particular focus necessary on ex-servicemen. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised, but the response failed to satisfy the residents in Killester. And what made it worse is that it got conflated with an eviction issue. The trust, as I've said, was reluctant to evict tenants, but they also were military men, and they took the view that discipline was discipline, and if you didn't do what needed to be done, well, then out you had to go. So eventually you would be evicted. And the two get conflated in Killester. And so there's a wider protest movement. We find in 1929 the development of a Tenants' Rights Association. And there's a packed meeting on the 28th of October. And you get a flavour of the annoyance and indeed the hurt from what's said. There's a long list of grievances, and they relate to rent, the quality of housing, the number of houses, the treatment of widows. But it's the comments. The Killester tenants had been victimised for some ulterior motive, and the time had arrived to test the matter. The houses were simply dumped in a field without any consideration being given to the essential services. They felt that they were being victimised. They felt that they had not been treated fairly. Now, the Land Trust did try to defuse the situation. They engaged with the people in London. They tried to get the rents decreased. They engaged with the local parish priest. They tried to find out ways whereby they could defuse the situation. But you get the sense that things are heading towards something serious in a letter which is sent by McAuliffe, who is the joint honorary secretary of the Killester Tenants Association, and it's sent to the Secretary of State for the Colonies in 1930. And it says, "We, the tenants of Killester, in meeting assembled, condemn in the strongest possible terms the action of the Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust in their threatened eviction of one of our numbers, Mr. Robert Butler. That we pledge our support to his defence in court when his case comes up for hearing. That we call on the government of Sarsthot Éireann to request the British government to make an exhaustive inquiry in public into the administration and general working of the trust, such inquiry to be held in Dublin." So you see, the two things are there. Two things have been conflated. There is a particular eviction issue for an individual, but there is the general degree of dissatisfaction with how the trust is operating and what it's doing. And there's a further development which makes the thing more complicated, in that the question of rent has moved from the question of level of rent to the question of whether or not they should be paying rent at all. You know, had the promise been housing, full stop, not housing with rent. So perhaps it was inevitable that it would end up in court, because in court it did end. In 1931, the Killester tenants begin an action in the High Court. It's in the name of 9 of the tenants, and it becomes associated with the first name person, Robert Leggett. It becomes known as the Leggett case. But it's not just those 9, it's pretty well everybody in Killester, and indeed it's the wider community of ex-servicemen. And they go to court on a whole series of issues relating to how the trust is operating, what it does, how it might be done, and so on and so forth. But the big question is, they're looking for judgment that they were entitled to have the cottages vested in them free from the obligation to pay rent. Now, this is really up the ante. Judgment is given in March of 1932, and they lose. They lose on all grounds. Mr. Justice Johnson is very sympathetic. He does understand their plight, and he is sympathetic to the issues that they're raising, but although he commends their counsel for the quality of the arguments that they put forward, he says very straightforwardly, "I cannot say that I have any sympathy whatever with the far-reaching claims that the men have put forward in this case. Claims which, in my opinion, cannot be substantiated by any of the allegations of law or fact set out in the statement of claim." That might have been the end of it, but in fact there is an appeal, and the appeal goes to the Supreme Court, and Mr. Justice Murnaghan writes the judgment. Now, on most grounds, the High Court judgment is upheld, but on the significant ground of rent, Mr. Justice Murnaghan comes to the view that the trust has no legal powers to charge rent. He comes to the view that there was nothing in the legislation which indicated that the trust should be given those powers. And so, as a stroke, the question of rent is gone. Now, it's interesting that a similar case takes place in the court in Belfast, and there the question of rent goes the other way. The tenants end up paying rent. The justice up there comes to the view that there is no basis for setting aside the payment of rent. So you get two different outcomes. So is this a victory for the tenants? It seems that it is. But once the initial euphoria has died down, there's a dawning that maybe it's a Pyrrhic victory. Yes, the tenants no longer had to pay rents, but they now had none of the rights that rent-paying tenants had. They feel that they're life tenants, perhaps, but there's no right of continuity for widows. And it was also now a matter of dispute as to who was responsible for maintenance. Now, it was a matter of dispute. You could argue that the trust remained responsible for maintenance, but the trust took a very hardline view on this, and you're going to have to bring them to court to make them do otherwise. They said, "You're not tenants. You're not paying rent. We don't have to maintain." And you see very quickly the effects of this. This is the revenue account from the annual report of the trust for the year after the judgment. And you can see the difference between the north and the south. In the north, they're still getting in rent, so they take in about £16,000 in rent. Down south, it's come down to £78. But that results in up north, they pay out £5,120 on maintenance. But down south, it's dropped to £1,300. Up north, they're still paying rates, £3,932. Down south, the trust is saying it's not our responsibility to pay rates, and it's fallen to 142. So very quickly, in the twinkling of an eye, you get a very different financial picture north and a very different financial picture south. And in fact, that continues right to the end of the trust. It says here, in accordance with the decision of the Supreme Court of the Irish Free State, dated 29th of July 1933, no rent has since been collected in that area for cottages occupied by ex-servicemen tenants. It gets a little bit worse, perhaps, for the tenants, because there's a later Supreme Court action in 1937 which clarifies their position. Again, is Mr. Justice Murnaghan, and he comes to the view that the ex-serviceman is a tenant at will. Now, a tenant at will means that they can be evicted at any moment, that the trust simply has to give them notice and out they go. Now, Justice Murnaghan assumes that he says the trust will no doubt control the property in a reasonable manner. But there was no obligation on the trust to do this. The trust could become bloody-minded if they thought that they could get away with it. So for these reasons, it was believed that the outcome suited neither party. The trust believed that it could negotiate a new relationship with the tenants, and it had met pretty well its target in relation to building, so the future was about maintenance. So they reckoned that they could do a deal, and they reckoned that the tenants would want to do a deal, something that would give them greater security. And this is where the government was going to come in. And this is where the relationship between the trust and the government became very, very interesting. It was now the De Valera government, it was now Fianna Fáil, and the government continued what had become a policy of benign indifference, as I call it. In essence, the Irish government was very content to let the trust get on with its job of building houses for ex-servicemen and maintaining them and dealing with all of that, as long as it didn't become a public issue. If it became a public issue, it raised all kinds of questions which the government didn't want to address. And so the government didn't want to get into the process of negotiating a new deal for ex-servicemen with the land trust. And at the same time, they didn't want to say that they weren't going to do it either. You know, so what do you do? What does a government do in circumstances like that? Well, the essence is they do nothing. You have meetings and you have discussions and proposals are made and there is comment on proposals. And then when this eventually maybe runs out of steam, you do what many governments do and you set up a committee. And that's what the government did. So it set up a committee of inquiry in 1940. This was the Committee of Inquiry into Property Administered by the Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust. It was created in March of 1940. It held 3 public sessions in April of that year. That doesn't seem an awful lot, but the committee was quite clear. It says that we spoke to everybody we needed to speak to. And the terms of reference tell you everything that you need to know about it. It's to examine the nature and extent of the difficulties which exist in relation to the property administered by the Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust, and to make recommendations as to the remedial action calculated to remove such difficulties as exist without imposing any charge on state funds. In other words, we're happy enough to get involved in making proposals which might sort out your problems, but we, the state, are not going to get involved in any kind of funding issue. The draft report is ready by May 1940, so the whole process is quite short. There is no record of any further drafts ever having been produced, and there is no record that the report was ever published. The recommendations in the report were pretty anodyne. I mean, they were pretty much as you would expect. So they wanted the trust to spend the necessary money to deal with maintenance issues, but not to charge the tenants. The tenants were going to engage in a new agreement with the trust, which would cover maintenance costs. They were tenants for life, but the trust could continue widows if they wanted, and the trust would be given powers to sell houses with the approval of the Minister for Local Government. They were hardly revolutionary ideas, but the government was not prepared to do anything about it. But what they now had was they had a report, or at least a draft report, and for the next number of years, when asked, the government would say that there were consultations continuing with the interested parties. And that went on. When you read the archive of the Land Trust, and the complete archive is in the Public Record Office in Kew in London, you see a gradual realisation in the Trust that the Irish government is not going to do anything, and certainly isn't going to legislate. And this was given greater focus by the fact that there was now the question being raised as to whether or not the mandate given to the Trust should be extended to deal with ex-servicemen and women who had fought during World War II. And again, it becomes clear very quickly that neither government wants to get involved, neither government wants to deal with that kind of issue. So the Trust very reluctantly comes to the view that they've reached the end game, that they're going to have to work within the circumstances that they have, and that means they're going to have to start selling off their houses down south. Up north is a different story, but they're going to have to sell their houses down south. And this results in the Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust Act of 1952, which is very simple. It is an act to extend the powers of the Irish Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust to sell cottages provided for the purposes of the trust. Once again, the Treasury is troublesome. The conditions under the sale are kind of onerous. It takes a bit of while to work it out, but nonetheless, by late 1958, it's reported that 580 cottages have been sold in Ireland. The scheme is further amended. There's more legislation in 1967, and it's simplified. The tenants, or the widow of the tenant, provided she has been in occupation on a continuous basis, can have the house for the market value less 10%. Now that's not generous. Dublin Corporation has begun a big sell-off of its own houses for entirely different reasons, and there the discounts can be of the order of 30%, even 40%. You know, once again, Her Majesty's Treasury is showing its parsimonious nature. But nonetheless, it's attractive enough for enough people to buy their houses to provide the trust with the money it now needs to continue to do its operation. So the trust, paradoxically, finds itself in a better position than it had been previously. It is winding down, and it decides that it's no longer going to build any houses for any new demands, because the cohort of ex-servicemen is now getting older, and more of them are looking for old folks accommodation. So what the trust decides is that it will buy or rent accommodation in schemes which are being provided by other providers. There is no obligation on existing tenants to buy their houses, so they will continue to maintain those. But bit by bit, you know, the effluxion of time, as time moves on, the cohort of ex-servicemen gets smaller and smaller as they die. And the end game comes. The final act in this came in 1987 in the UK Parliament and 1988 in the Irish Parliament, where the legislation is passed to wind up the Sailors and Soldiers Land Trust. Now, what's involved is the liquidation of the existing assets, and the money is used for a series of north-south projects. It marks the end of a very interesting organisation, an imperial trust which operated on an increasingly independent country, run out of London and funded by the British Exchequer, building houses for ex-servicemen. It had created some very interesting urban landscapes, and many of these urban landscapes survive to the present day. It had made a significant contribution to the housing issues of the city of Dublin in particular, but the country generally, at a time when housing was a major problem. So it had been important, and it also had been interesting. But by 1988, the story was now over. Thank you very much.